My hand trembled as I stared at the envelope Jack had tossed onto the kitchen table. It wasn't his usual controlled kind of anger, this was something different. Cold. Distant. Like something had broken and couldn't be put back together. Care to explain why your name is on a $200,000 loan for your sister? He asked, his voice low but razor sharp. I felt the blood drain from my face. My knees buckled as I reached for the chair behind me. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I had no idea what he was talking about. At least, that's what I told myself. But deep down, I already knew. Because a year ago, Julie had cried over the phone. She said she needed me. She promised it was just for a car. Something temporary. Just a signature. No money would ever come out of my pocket. And I, like the fool I'd been so many times before, signed without reading the fine print. Jack's eyes didn't move from me. I could see it in his face, the trust we'd spent 27 years building was unraveling right there in our kitchen. And all because I thought being a good sister meant saying yes, no matter the cost. I wanted to scream. At Julie. At myself. At the twisted idea of family loyalty that had brought me here. But instead, I whispered the only truth I could manage. I didn't know it was that much. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I didn't sleep that night. Jack hadn't said another word after dropping the envelope. He grabbed his coat, said he needed air, and didn't come home until almost dawn. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment with Julie over the past year, every vague excuse, every time she'd dodged my questions about her finances. It all made sense now. She hadn't just borrowed my name. She had gambled with my marriage, my home, our future. When the front door finally creaked open around 5 a.m., I sat up and met Jack's tired eyes. There was no anger left in his face. Just something worse, disappointment. He dropped into the armchair across from the bed and rubbed his hands together, like he didn't know what to do with them. Do you even understand what this means, Diane? Our retirement, everything we planned for. If she defaults, it's not her credit on the line. It's ours. I swallowed hard. I didn't know, Jack. I swear to you. I thought it was just a car. She said. She said? His voice cracked into a bitter laugh. And that's enough for you to sign away our future? My chest tightened. She's my sister. And I'm your husband, he said. Quietly. Or at least I thought I was. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. Jack wasn't just angry, he was hurt. And I had no defense. All I could do was nod and say, I'll fix this. He didn't say anything else. Just stood up, walked to the bathroom, and shut the door. I sat there, alone, realizing for the first time just how far this had gone. This wasn't just about money. It was about trust. About boundaries I'd never drawn with my family. And if I didn't do something soon, I wouldn't just lose my savings. I'd lose the only man who had ever truly stood by me. The next morning, I drove to Julie's apartment with my heart thudding like a drum. I didn't call ahead. I couldn't. I needed to see her face when I asked the questions I had avoided for far too long. She opened the door in her robe, mascara smudged, hair in a messy bun. Behind her, the living room was a wreck, piles of unopened mail, empty takeout containers, and something that looked like an eviction notice pinned to the fridge. Diane, she blinked, clearly surprised. What are you doing here so early? I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. We need to talk. Now. Julie's smile faltered. Can it wait? I haven't even had coffee. No, I said firmly. It can't. I pulled the folder from my bag and laid it on her cluttered coffee table. Jack found this yesterday. The loan documents. The credit cards. The forged signatures. You used my name, Julie. You signed as me. For over $86,000. She froze, her face paling. Diane, I can explain. You lied to me, I snapped. My voice cracked, but I didn't care. All those times you said it was just a temporary thing, that you were almost caught up. And I believed you, because I wanted to believe you. Julie's hands trembled as she reached for a cigarette. I didn't mean to hurt you. I got behind. Then I got scared. And I thought I could fix it before anyone found out. You thought you could fix it? By taking out another loan? By ruining my credit? She didn't answer. Just sat there, silent, flicking her lighter with shaking fingers. I leaned closer. Do you even realize what you've done to me? To Jack? He doesn't trust me anymore. Our retirement, gone. He's thinking about selling the lake house. That got her attention. Her eyes widened. No. Diane, no. You love that house. I did. Until it became collateral damage in your mess. Julie looked away, tears brimming. I didn't know how to ask for help. No, I said quietly. You just took it instead. The silence between us was thick and painful. And for the first time in our lives, I didn't reach out to comfort her. I stood up, picked up the folder, and said, You have a choice, Julie. Come clean. Own up to what you've done. Or I go to the police. She looked at me like I'd slapped her. And maybe I had, just not with my hands. 3 days passed before she called. Not a text. Not an email. A real phone call. When I saw her name flash on my screen, my stomach flipped. Part of me didn't want to answer. But I did. Her voice was quiet. Hello. I've made an appointment with a lawyer, she said. I'm going to sign over full responsibility for the debt. I know that won't fix everything. But it's a start. I didn't speak right away. I needed to breathe through the storm of emotions inside me. Relief, exhaustion, anger that hadn't quite faded. But also, a strange, quiet ache that used to be love. And the credit cards? I asked. I've already canceled them. I've set up a payment plan. It's not much, but I'll pay back every cent. Even if it takes me the rest of my life. I closed my eyes. That's what taking responsibility looks like, Julie. Thank you. She was crying. Softly. I didn't offer comfort. Not yet. That night, Jack and I sat across from each other in the kitchen. He was swirling his glass of red wine but hadn't taken a sip. She called? He asked. I nodded. She's trying to make it right. He exhaled. And what about us? It was the first time he'd asked that since the night everything fell apart. I reached for his hand. We're not broken, Jack. We're bruised. But bruises heal. He looked at me then. Really looked at me. And I saw the man I'd married all those years ago, behind the hurt and the worry. I want us back, he said. So do I. And just like that, something shifted. A thread stitching us back together, slow but steady. But I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a long, necessary rebuild, between Jack and me, and maybe, one day, between Julie and me. But from now on, there would be boundaries. Firm. Unshakable. And no one, no matter how close, would cross them again. Spring came late that year, as if the world itself had been holding its breath alongside me. Jack and I had started therapy. At first, I'd been hesitant, he was too logical, I was too used to swallowing emotions. But slowly, week by week, we began to speak truths we'd long kept buried. I felt betrayed, he said once, voice low but steady. Not just by Julie. By you. I nodded, even though it stung. I know. I didn't see it then, but I made excuses for too long. I thought I was protecting her, but I was just avoiding conflict. He didn't respond with words that day. Just reached over and placed his hand over mine. It was enough. Meanwhile, Julie was keeping her promise. She sent proof of her payments every month, screenshots, receipts, letters from the debt collectors. She never asked for anything in return. Not forgiveness. Not even a thank you. It was strange, the way that felt, relief mixed with sorrow. I loved her, still. But I couldn't forget how easily she'd gambled with my life. And yet, I saw growth in her. Her voice steadier when we spoke. Her choices more deliberate. The desperation had faded, replaced by something unfamiliar, accountability. One afternoon, I found an old photo tucked in the back of my closet. It was from my wedding. Julie had been my maid of honor. Her smile was real. Mine was, too. I sat on the floor for a long time with that photo in my lap, wondering how two women who once shared everything had grown so far apart. Wondering if one day, somehow, we could find our way back, not to what we were, but to something honest. That night, I told Jack about the picture. He listened quietly, then asked, "Would you ever want her back in your life?" I thought for a long time. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe. But only if it's on new terms." With eyes wide open this time. He nodded. "That's fair." And for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Hope. Quiet. Fragile. But real. A few months later, Jack and I found ourselves standing on the front porch of a modest cafe, the kind with creaky wooden floors and handwritten chalkboard menus. It was Julie's idea. She'd asked to meet, not to plead, not to explain, but, as she put it, just to talk like grown-ups. I was nervous. My palms were damp, and I could feel Jack's steady presence beside me like an anchor. He wasn't here to mediate. He was here because I needed him, and he understood that without me having to say it. Julie was already inside when we walked in. She stood as we approached, awkwardly smoothing the front of her blouse. There were lines on her face I didn't remember, marks of worry, maybe growth. "Hi," she said quietly. "Hi," I replied. There was a long silence after we sat down. No waiter approached. It felt like the whole room was holding its breath. Julie was the first to speak. "I know I have no right to ask for anything. But I wanted to tell you this in person." She glanced at Jack briefly, then back at me. "I'm paying everything back. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because I want to live a life I'm not ashamed of." I didn't speak. I just listened. I've started working with a nonprofit that helps women with debt recovery. Most of them are in worse shape than I ever was. But I tell them about you, how you didn't scream or cut me off entirely. How you held me accountable without hate. Tears prickled behind my eyes, unexpected. "I'm not asking you to forget," she continued, voice steady. "I just wanted you to know I'm trying to be someone you could trust again. Even if we're not sisters the way we used to be." I looked at her then, really looked. There was no manipulation in her eyes. No excuses. Just exhaustion, humility, and hope. I reached for Jack's hand under the table. He gave it a gentle squeeze, and I understood what he was saying without a word. The choice was mine. So I took a breath, and I said, "I'm proud of you for trying. That matters." Julie's lip trembled. She nodded. We didn't hug. We didn't promise anything. But for the first time in a long time, we smiled at each other. Not as broken sisters. But as two women trying to rebuild something fragile and real. Something that, maybe, still had a chance. 6 months later, the damage still lingered, but so did the healing. Jack and I had adjusted our financial plan, canceled a few vacations, tightened our budget, and started putting money back into our emergency fund. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt grounded, like we were rebuilding something sturdier than before. Emotionally, though, it was more complicated. I'd started seeing a therapist. At first, I told myself it was just to process the betrayal from Julie. But what came out during those sessions surprised me. I talked about growing up in a family where I was always the responsible one. The fixer. The peacemaker. The one who covered up, cleaned up, and never said no. I realized that I'd spent decades confusing loyalty with self-abandonment. And that lesson, as painful as it was, became the unexpected gift hidden inside the wreckage. One evening, Jack and I were sitting on the back porch, sharing a quiet glass of wine while cicadas hummed in the background. He looked at me over the rim of his glass and said, "You're different, you know." Lighter. I smiled, feeling it too. Not carefree, no, life had never been that for me. But clear. Setting boundaries is, weirdly peaceful, I said with a chuckle. It's like finally putting down a weight I didn't realize I was carrying. We didn't talk much more that night. We didn't need to. The air between us was easy again. Julie and I weren't close in the old sense. But she sent updates now and then, about work, about her progress paying off the debt, about a workshop she was leading on financial literacy. Sometimes I responded. Sometimes I didn't. And that was okay too. Because this time I wasn't managing anyone's guilt but my own. And for the first time in a long time I was finally free of it. 1 year to the day after the truth came out, I stood in front of our fire pit with a folder in my hand, the very same folder Jack had discovered 12 months earlier. Inside were the documents that once felt like a ticking time bomb, loan agreements, forged signatures, bounced payments, all under my name without my knowledge. I took one last look at them, not with anger this time, but with something closer to closure. Then I fed them into the flames. Jack stood beside me, silently. His arm brushed mine as the paper curled and blackened. "Feels like the final chapter," he said softly. "It is," I whispered. Julie hadn't asked for forgiveness. And I hadn't given it, at least not in the way she might have hoped. But I had released the hold her betrayal had over me. I wasn't angry anymore. Just done. In the months since our last real conversation, she'd sent a few more texts, all vague and passive. "Hope you're well, thought of you today, miss you." I never blocked her. But I didn't respond either. Not because I wanted to punish her. Because I finally understood, love without boundaries becomes sacrifice. And sacrifice, without consent, becomes resentment. That night, Jack and I cooked dinner together. Nothing fancy, just grilled chicken and roasted vegetables, but we laughed more than we had in months. There was something in our silence that night that wasn't empty anymore. It was full. Of respect. Of partnership. Of clarity. Later, I wrote in my journal. Family doesn't mean unquestioned loyalty. It means truth. And truth sometimes means letting go. If someone had told me a year ago that this heartbreak would lead me to peace, I would have laughed in their face. But now I know. Some endings don't need applause. Just a quiet nod to say, I made it through. And I'm better for it. 2 weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. Handwritten. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Julie. I stared at it for an hour before I opened it. A part of me wanted to toss it in the trash, leave the past where it belonged, but something told me to read it. It wasn't long. Just a single page. She didn't ask for forgiveness. Not exactly. Instead, she wrote about how she finally hit her own bottom, how the bank had come for her car, how the shame of being caught forced her to finally look in the mirror. She said, "I used your name because I believed you'd always save me. I never thought what it would cost you. I see it now. I see all of it." There was no plea to talk. No manipulation. Just ownership. And for the first time, I cried not because I was angry, or hurt, or confused, but because I knew the cycle had broken. Not just for me, but maybe, just maybe, for her too. I didn't write back. At least not then. But I took that letter and placed it in the back of my journal, between the pages I'd written during the hardest nights. Not to keep the pain alive, but to remember what I survived. Jack and I took a short trip to the coast that weekend. We walked the beach like we used to when we were dating. No phones. No emails. Just the sound of waves and sand between our toes. One evening, as the sun dipped below the waterline, Jack turned to me and said, "Do you regret any of it?" I thought for a while, then shook my head. "No," I said. "Because if I hadn't gone through it, I'd still be carrying the weight of someone else's choices." I needed to learn that it's okay to say enough. And I did. That night, I slept without dreams. Just peace. Some people might think the story ends with a reunion, or a family healed and whole again. But sometimes healing means walking forward with scars. Quiet, invisible ones that remind you how far you've come, and why you'll never go back. And that was more than enough.